Hello there everybody, and welcome back to another EDH gameplay video brought to you by Affinity for Commander. My name is Martin, and today we have a battle between four spooky scary decks. It was a video I took in preparation for Halloween, but may have lost the video file. But I found it now, so everything's okay. Yes, this video contains everything you could ever want. Vampires, werewolves, spiders, zombies, we have the lot. But before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of our amazing patrons, without whom this video would not be possible. Your support means more to us than you could ever know, so thank you. Also, if you make any purchases from these websites, then be sure to do so via our affiliate link in the video description. It won't cost you anything extra, but it really helps us out. And finally, if you haven't checked out aldersleeves.com yet, then go and do so. You can find some beautiful artwork to alter the appearance of your favourite cards, and the best bit is it's reversible and much cheaper than having regular alters done. Just be sure to mention us as the ones who sent you there. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at those opening hands. I am playing my Edgar Markov Vampire Tribal deck, which aims to power up the tokens that my commander produces with a variety of lords and anthem effects. I also run a healthy amount of removal to deal with my opponent's biggest threats, allowing me to attack with my army of bloodsuckers unimpeded. My opening hand consists of Legion Lieutenant, Sovereign Lord of Innistrad, Patron of the Vein, Rakdos Guildgate, Windscarred Crag, and 2 Swamps.
Connor is playing his Tovolar Dire Overlord Werewolf Tribal deck, which, similarly to Martin's deck, runs a lot of power and toughness spells to pummel his creatures with. He's also running a wolf sub-theme, which synergizes surprisingly well with his army of lycanthropes. Connor's opening hand contains Green Sun Zenith, Scorned Villager, Afflicted Deserter, Tovolar's Huntmaster, a mountain, and 2 forests.
Phil is playing his Ishkanah Graft Widow Reanimator deck, which runs a decent amount of self-mill effects to fill his graveyard with. He is also running a lot of cards that have multiple types, making it easier for him to trigger his commander's Delirium ability. Phil keeps a starting hand of Sol Ring, Nihil Spell Bomb, Traverse the Overvold, Kenrith's Transformation, World Shaper, Reliquary Tower, and Yavimaya Cradle of Growth.
And finally, Danny is playing his Scarab God Zombie Tribal deck. Unlike most zombie decks, Danny's focus is mainly on the production and support of zombie tokens, and even runs a sneaky little Aristocrats package to hurt his opponents when his army of disposable 2/2s are destroyed. Danny keeps an opening hand of Dread Horde Invasion, Gleaming Overseer, Eternal Skylord, Horde Wing Scab, Liliana Death's Majesty, a Snow-Covered Island, and a Snow-Covered Swamp. Phil wins the die roll, plays Yavimaya Cradle of Growth, casts Sol Ring, and uses this to cast Nihil Spellbomb. Pleased with this turn 1 board state, he passes to Martin.
I play Temple of Silence, keeping the top card of my library where it is, and pass.
Danny plays Tainted Isle and ends his turn.
Connor plays a forest and with nothing more to do, passes to Phil.
Phil starts his turn by casting Traverse the Ulvenwald, searching his library for a swamp and putting it into his hand. He then plays the aforementioned land and passes the turn.
I also play a swamp and cast Legion Lieutenant. This triggers my commander's Eminence ability, creating a 1/1 vampire token, and I end my turn.
Danny plays a Snow-Covered Swamp and casts Dread Horde Invasion. Unable to do anything else, he passes to Connor.
Connor plays a mountain and casts Scorned Villager before passing the turn.
Phil plays Reliquary Tower and then casts World Shaper. With 1 mana open, he ends his turn.
I play a swamp and cast Captivating Vampire. Edgar creates me another vampire token, and I move to combat where I attack Danny with my non-sick token and Connor with my lieutenants. Neither player blocks, with both of them taking 3 damage, and I pass to Danny.
In Danny's upkeep, Dread Horde Invasion triggers, creating him a 0/0 zombie army token with a +1/+1 counter on it. Danny then loses a life to the enchantment, plays a Snow-Covered Island, and casts Gleaming Overseer. This puts another +1/+1 counter on his token, as well as giving it Hexproof and Menace. Happy with his play, Danny passes the turn.
Connor plays the forest and casts his commander, Tovolar, Dire Overlord. This marks the time of day as, well, day, and Connor ends his turn.
Phil begins his turn by casting Kenrith's transformation, turning Captivating Vampire into a 3/3 elk with no abilities. Phil draws from the enchantment, plays Urza's Saga, and pops a lore counter on it. Next, he casts Death Reap Ritual and moves to combat. Here, Phil attacks Danny with his Merfolk, milling 3 cards with the creature's attack trigger. Danny blocks with his Overseer, resulting in neither creature dying, and Phil passes to Martin.
I play Opal Palace and tap out to cast Bloodline Keeper.
Will you stop playing Lords?
Never! I make a Vampire, move to combat, and attack Phil with 2 tokens, Legion Lieutenant and my Elk. Unable to block, Phil takes 9 damage, and I pass the turn.
Danny loses a life, puts a +1/+1 counter on his army, and plays Temple of Deceit. He scries 1, leaving the top card of his library where it is, and casts a super shiny Plague Belcher. Danny puts 2 -1/-1 counters on his army, shrinking them down to a 1/1, and then ends his turn.
Connor plays Reliquary Tower and then moves to combat. Here he attacks Phil with both of his creatures, dealing him 4 damage and drawing 2 cards from his commander's ability. Connor then passes to Phil.
In Phil's turn, daylight gives way to night, transforming Tovolar into Tovolar the Midnight Scourge. Then in Phil's upkeep, Scorned Villager transforms into Moon-Scarred Werewolf. Phil then puts a counter on his Saga, plays a Swamp, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with World Shaper, milling 3 cards in the process, and Martin blocks the Shaman with his 4/4 Bloodline Keeper. Phil then misreads World Shaper, thinking it has a May ability, and chooses not to return the land in his graveyard to the battlefield.
Silly Phil.
He then moves to his post-combat main phase where he casts his commander, Ishkanah, Graft Widow, and creates 3 1/2 spider tokens with the Creepy Crawlies ETB.
I feel like I should make a film reference here, but don't want to risk spoiling anything for people who haven't seen it.
Not yet finished, Phil exiles 5 cards and taps 2 of his webheads to cast Hogak, Arisen Necropolis. He then moves to his end step where he draws a card from his enchantment and passes the turn.
In my turn, night becomes day, and both Tovolar and Moon-Scarred Werewolf transform back into their human halves. I then play Wind-Scarred Crag, gaining a life, and transform Bloodline Keeper into Lord of Lineage. My other vampires receive a lovely +2/+2 buff, and I move to combat. Here I attack Danny with my 3 vampire tokens, and Connor with my Lieutenant and Elkified Captivator. Connor responds to this by flashing in Nightpack Ambusher. He blocks the Elk with his Doggo, and Danny blocks one of the Bloodsuckers coming at him with his zombie army. My Elk dies alongside Danny's army, Danny takes 8, and Connor takes 4. Playcrafter's ability then triggers, causing Connor, Phil and I to take 1 damage. Phil draws a card from Death Reap Ritual, and I end my turn.
Danny loses a life to Dreadhorde Invasion and creates a brand new zombie army token. Next he plays a Snow-Covered Island and passes to Connor.
In Connor's turn, day once again succumbs to night, and both of his humans transform into their furrier sides. Connor then plays a forest and casts Green Sun's Zenith, where X is 3. He searches his library for Immerwolf, puts the puppet into play, and then realises that he should have cast Rhythm of the Wild before doing this. Being the generous people that we are, the table lets Connor rewind his turn to do this, meaning that Immerwolf enters with a +1/+1 counter.
How kind of you.
Connor then moves to combat where he attacks me with his commander. I declare no blocks, taking 6 damage, and Connor draws a card. With nothing more to do, Connor passes the turn, and I respond to this by casting Rakdos Charm, exiling Phil's graveyard. With no further interruptions, Phil proceeds to his turn.
In Phil's turn, night becomes day, but Connor's werewolves don't transform due to Immerwolf's ability. Phil then taps Urza's Saga for mana, puts a final counter on it, and puts Skullclamp into play from his library with the Enchantment Lands ability. The Saga is then sacrificed and Phil casts Nature's Law. He searches his library for a forest, puts the land into play, and plays Wasteland as his land for turn. Phil then moves to combat where he attacks Martin with Hogak and Connor with Ishkanah. Martin responds to this by tapping Lord of Lineage to create a 2/2 vampire token with flying, which he used to block the massive dead bodies coming his way. Phil asks Connor if he would kindly kill his commander for him, and Connor blocks the spider with his mono green wolf. Martin's token is destroyed and Phil puts his leggy friend into the graveyard instead of the command zone.
Ooh, how mysterious.
In his second main phase, Phil sacrifices his spellbomb to exile Martin's graveyard in the world's greatest revenge play, and then draws a card. Next he casts Diagraph Rebirth, returning his beloved Arachnid to the battlefield. This creates Phil 3 more wall crawlers, one of which he instantly attaches his Skullclamp to before moving to his end step. Here he draws a card from his enchantment and ends his turn.
I play Rakdos Guildgate, a land that I can't believe I used to run, and cast Sorin, Lord of Innistrad. I activate his -2 ability, giving a permanent +1 to my creature's power, and then move to combat. Here I attack Danny with all 3 of my 5/4 vampire tokens, and Danny blocks each of them with one of his creatures. Not yet finished though, Danny flashes in Dictator of Erebos, and damage then occurs. All 3 of Danny's creatures and one of my vampires die in combat, and Connor, Phil and I are forced to sacrifice 3 creatures each to the Dictate. I respond to this by tapping Lord of Lineage to create a 2/2 vampire, sacrifices occur, and the 3 of us then also lose 2 life to the Plague Belcher. Phil draws 2 cards, given that he sacrificed the spider that had been skull-clamped, and Connor puts his commander into the graveyard. With a much smaller looking board state, I pass to Danny, and Phil draws a card from his ritual.
Danny loses a life to his enchantment, creates a zombie army token, and casts Eternal Skylord. This puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his army, as well as granting it flying, and Danny passes the turn.
Connor begins his turn by casting All-In, the Pack's Hope. He uses her -3 ability to create 2 2/2 good boys, and ends his turn.
Phil starts his turn by attaching Skullclamp to his commander, and then moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with Hogak and Sorin with Ishkanah, and Martin declares no blocks, taking 8 damage. Sorin's ulti is reduced to 0, sending him to the graveyard, and Phil moves to his second main phase. Here he plays Golgari Rotfarm, returning a tapped forest to his hand, and then casts Sylvan Library, closely followed by 3 visits. Phil searches his library for Overgrown Tomb, puts the Shockland into play tapped, and casts Journey to Eternity. He enchants one of his web slingers with the enchantment, stating that he doesn't care if it dies, he just wants the land. With no further plays, Phil passes to Martin.
In my turn, I cast Patron of the Vein, making a vampire token of Edgar's Eminence ability. I choose to destroy and exile Hogak with the vampire's ETB, and with the Patron's second trigger on the stack, I tap Lord of Lineage to make a flying vampire token. The ability then resolves, putting a +1/+1 counter on each of my vampires, and I move to combat. Here I attack Phil with Legion Lieutenant, and he blocks with his enchanted spider. The 8-legged one is destroyed, and Phil's enchantment returns to the battlefield, transformed into Atzal, Cave of Eternity. Patron of the Vein's ability triggers once again, putting another +1/+1 counter on each of my creatures, and with nothing more to do, I move to my end step. Phil draws a card from Deathreap Ritual, and I pass the turn.
Danny loses a life, puts a +1/+1 counter on his token, and casts Liliana, Death's Majesty. He uses her +1 ability to create a 2/2 zombie token, mills 2 cards, and ends his turn.
In his turn, Connor plays a mountain and then casts Eternal Witness. He returns his commander from his graveyard to his hand, casts him, and puts a +1/+1 counter on the Witness and the Werewolf with Rhythm of the Wild. Not yet finished, Connor activates All-In's +1 ability, realising that he should have done this before casting his creatures.
Oh dear.
Deeply saddened by this revelation, Connor passes to Phil.
Phil draws 2 additional cards from Sylvan Library and pays 4 life to keep one of them in his hand. He puts the other back on top of his library, plays Command Tower, and casts everybody's favourite Spider Tribal card, Blex Vexing Pest. Not quite finished, Phil casts Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, and passes the turn.
I play Terramorphic Expanse, which I immediately sacrifice to put a Plains into play from my library. Next I cast the Granddaddy himself, Edgar Markov, and move to combat. Here I attack Connor with my Patron and my Flying Vampire token, and Phil with Edgar and my non-Flying Vampire token. With Mr. Markov's trigger on the stack, I tap Lord of Lineage to create another Flying Vampire, and then puts a +1/+1 counter on each of my Bloodsuckers. Phil responds to this by casting Assassin's Trophy, destroying Lord of Lineage, and allowing me to put a mountain into play from my library. Unable to block, Connor takes 16 damage, and Phil declares no blocks, taking 13. Realising that I'm about to experience a heck of a retaliation from both players, I move to my end step. Phil draws a card from his enchantment, and I end my turn.
Danny loses a life, puts a +1/+1 counter on his army, and plays Exotic Orchard. Next he casts Hordewing Scab, and Phil asks Danny if he wants to activate Liliana's -7 ability this turn in order to wipe Martin's board.
Rude.
As a gesture of goodwill, Phil activates Yawgmoth's ability, discarding a card to proliferate the +1/+1 counters on Danny's army, as well as the loyalty counters on both Liliana and Arlen. Danny thanks Phil for this and activates his Planeswalker's -7 ability, destroying all non-zombie creatures. Liliana's loyalty is reduced to 0, sending her to the graveyard, and Phil responds by sacrificing his commander, his spider tokens, and Blex to Yawgmoth's ability. He pays 4 life to do this, gains 4 from Blex, and draws 6 cards thanks to Yawgmoth and Skullclamp. Liliana's ability then resolves with all creatures not owned by Martin that were destroyed this turn being exiled by Patron of the Vein. Moving to combat, Danny attacks Martin with all of his zombies that were able to do so, dealing him 11 damage. Danny then gains 6 thanks to Dreadhorde Invasion, then draws and discards a card thanks to his Scab. With nothing more to do, Danny moves to his end step, where Phil draws a card from Death 3 Ritual. Happy with his position in the game, Danny passes to Connor.
In his turn, Connor casts Tovolar's Huntmaster, creating 2 2/2 wolf tokens when the Lycanthrope enters the battlefield. Connor chooses to give the Huntmaster haste with Rhythm of the Wild, and moves to combat, where he attacks me with the crossbow-wielding Puppy Producer. I take 6 damage, lowering my life total to a barely alive amount, and Connor moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he activates Olin's +1 ability, once again realising that he should have done this before casting his Werewolf, and passes the turn.
Phil draws 3, putting 2 of these back on top of his library, and plays a Swamp. Joining on the Planeswalker bandwagon, Phil casts Werq, Cursed Huntsman, and uses the Beefcake 0 ability to create 2 2/2 wolf tokens.
If you get the reference to what Phil's tokens are, then I'm afraid to inform you that that show ended 22 years ago.
Yikes. Not yet finished, Phil recasts Ishkanah, creating 3 spiders with the Graft Widow's ETB. Relieved that he now has blockers that can block Danny's flyers, Phil ends his turn.
I begin my turn by casting Cordial Vampire, creating a vampire token thanks to Edgar. Next I cast Commander Sphere, which I immediately tap for black mana and sacrifice to draw a card. I then use my floating mana to help cast Drana, Liberator of Malakir, creating another vampire, and pass to Danny.
Danny loses yet another life to Dreadhorde Invasion and puts another +1/+1 counter on his zombie army. He then plays Reflecting Pool and finally casts his commander, the Scarab God. Moving to combat, Danny attacks Martin with both of his tokens, and Martin blocks the 2/2 zombie with Drana. First strike damage occurs where the Blood Chief destroys the undead before her, which triggers Dictative Erebos. Everyone other than Danny sacrifices a creature, with Phil sacrificing a wolf and putting a loyalty counter on Werq. Martin then takes lethal damage from the unblocked zombie army, and Danny gains 7 from the creature's lifelink. He draws and discards with Hordewing Scab and moves to his end step, where Phil draws a card. With nothing more to do, Danny passes the turn.
Connor plays Rockfall Veil and activates his Planeswalker's +1 ability.
He did it, guys. He remembered what order to do things in.
With his creatures now having flash, Connor ends his turn without casting anything.
Day gives way to night in Phil's turn, transforming Tovolar's Huntmaster into Tovolar's pack leader. But wait, there's more. Arlen transforms into Arlen the Moon's Fury, sorry I read that wrong, I mean Fury, and Phil draws 3, putting 2 cards on top of his library. He plays a forest and activates Garrick's -6 ability, sending the Planeswalker to the graveyard. This grants him an emblem, giving his creatures +3/+3 and trample, and Phil once again clamps his commander's skull with his equipment. Moving to combat, Phil attacks Danny with all of his creatures. Danny blocks the wolf with his Skylord and 2 spiders with the Scarab God and his Scab. Before damage, Phil casts Golgari Charm, destroying Dictator Erebos and causing Danny to let out a cry of despair. Danny's 2 blocking zombies are destroyed alongside one of Phil's spiders, and Danny takes 14 damage from unblocked and tramply creatures. In his second main phase, Phil casts a super shiny Tivash Sezat, Doom of Fools, and uses his +1 ability, sacrificing Ishkanah. This draws Phil 2 cards from Skull Clamp, as well as 3 cards from the ability, which I'm sure you'll all agree is pretty good going.
Indeed.
Phil once again puts his commander into his graveyard and moves to his end step. Here he draws a card from his enchantment and passes to Danny.
Night once again becomes day, transforming Connor's creatures back into their human forms, and Danny loses a life to his enchantment. He puts a +1/+1 counter on his zombie army and plays Mana Confluence as his land for turn. Danny then taps out, paying a life in order to cast Army of the Damned. This creates him 13 tapped 2/2 zombie tokens, all but ensuring him the win next turn if Connor and Phil fail to deal with him or his board before then. Moving to combat, Danny attacks Connor with his zombie army, not to be confused with his army of zombies.
An easy mistake to make.
Unable to block, Connor takes 8 and Danny gains 8 before passing the turn. Connor responds to this by flashing in Tovolar, who enters with a +1/+1 counter thanks to Arlen. He then forgets that Rhythm of the Wilds could also be used to give his commander another counter and proceeds to his turn.
In Connor's upkeep, Tovolar changes the time from day to night, transforming Arlen the Huntmaster and himself into their moon-cursed counterparts. Connor then activates Arlen's 0 ability, making it a 5/5 creature with trample, indestructible, and haste until the end of turn. Not yet finished, Connor casts Afflicted Deserter, giving the creature haste with Rhythm of the Wilds. Next, Connor casts Primal Adversary, giving the woofer haste with his enchantment, and moves to combat. Here he makes a truce with Phil and turns his board sideways, attacking Danny with the Lot. Tovolar's pack leader's ability triggers, creating 2 2/2 wolf tokens, and Danny blocks Arlen with his commander. Even with this block, Danny takes lethal damage, and Connor forgets that Arlen has Indestructible, putting her into the grave. With only one opponent left, Connor ends his turn.
In Phil's turn, night becomes day, transforming Tovolar and his Packmaster into their human sides. Phil then begins his turn by casting Demonic Tutor, searching his library for a card and putting it into his hand. Phil casts Stitcher Supplier, milling 3 cards, and then casts Revival Experiment. He pays 6 life to return the Garrick Cursed Huntsman and Ishkanah Graph Widow from his graveyard to the battlefield, creating himself 4 new spider tokens of his commander's ETB. Next, Phil activates his Planeswalker's 0 ability, creating 2 more wolves, and casts Eternal Witness. He returns Assassin's Trophy to his hand and casts the spell, destroying Tovolar's Huntmaster. Connor searches his library for a forest, puts the land into play tapped, and Phil passes the turn.
In Connor's turn, Tovolar's ability makes it nighttime, transforming both himself and Afflicted Deserter, with the latter becoming a Werewolf Ransacker. Connor used the Ransacker's ability to destroy Phil's Skull Clamp, dealing him 3 damage and winning Connor the game.
Not quite how I was expecting the game to end, but it got the job done.
Well, that was certainly an interesting game. I do hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget that you can help out the channel in 4 quick and easy ways: liking this video, subscribing, hitting the bell icon, and leaving us a comment. I read every one.
Also, if you really like the channel, then be sure to check out our Patreon page, where you can find exclusive rewards such as custom tokens and playmats for as little as $1 a month. That's all for now though, we'll see you next time. Stay awesome!